Hello! Did you know you can jump Bale's arena-wide nuke? Did you know you can slap Sister Frida out of the sky or parry some charge attacks? Did you know you can deflect physical projectiles with melee weapons or force some bosses to loop the same attacks over and over? Welcome! Let's talk about Souls games combat. So Souls games are notoriously complicated to understand, with most of the mechanics left to us, players, to figure out by ourselves. Coupled with an unforgiving combat system, it makes the games difficult to approach. Having spent a decent amount of time playing Souls games and doing challenge runs since the Dark Souls 3 days, I've learned a lot of tips and tricks in the past years. So in this video, I am going to put my knowledge to use and explain to you the intricacies of the Souls combat system. This guide is going to cover combat in Dark Souls 1, 2, 3 and Elden Ring. I will start with fundamentals for beginners and returning players, then dive into more complex combat mechanics with advanced tips and tricks along the way, and then give my insight as a long-term player on how to survive and overcome the world of Souls games. Whether you've been playing for 5 days or 2 years, I got you covered. If you're willing to apply the advice I'm giving you, and you can handle listening to my French accent for the next hour and 30, you will get much better at Souls games, and any encounter or boss fight will become a breeze for whatever build or challenge you feel like doing. So how does a Souls fight even work? Well, combat in Souls games tends to boil down to how do I get this enemy out of my screen before it sends me back to the loading screen in a horrifying manner. There's plenty of options you have to achieve this. You can stab, slash, strike, blast, shoot, counter, etc. But it comes down to knowing how to do it the most effectively. Let's begin with the fundamental gameplay mechanics, starting with the attribute bars at the top of your screen. Your red bar represents your health points and is responsible for keeping you alive. Health points are tied to the vitality stat in DS1 and vigor stat in other Souls games. Your blue bar represents your focus points, which enable you to do magic-related actions like casting spells, performing weapon skills, or using powerful consumables. Focus points are tied to the attunement stat in Dark Souls games and the mind stat in Elden Ring. Both health and focus points are replenished by resting at checkpoints, consuming a flask, and by using certain spells, consumables, or equipment effects. In Dark Souls 1 and 2, the focus bar doesn't exist. Instead, spells have a set amount of uses which can be increased or restored in similar ways. Your green bar represents your stamina points, which allow you to perform most combat-related actions such as dodging, attacking, blocking, or sprinting. Stamina points are tied to the endurance stat in all Souls games, and regenerate naturally over time, faster or slower depending on your equip load and active stamina regeneration buffs or debuffs. In Elden Ring, stamina points are not consumed when performing actions out of combat, letting you, for example, sprint infinitely. If you perform an action that takes more stamina than you have left, you will go into negative stamina. Your stamina regeneration will then recover that negative stamina portion first, before starting to fill your bar again. When you lose health, focus or stamina points, that portion of the respective bar will turn yellow to let you estimate how many more of those hits you can take, spells you can cast, or actions you can perform before the bar is depleted. Alright, now before diving into the combat mechanics themselves, let's do a quick overview of the ways your character resists and deals damage, which is defenses and damage types. In Dark Souls 3 and Elden Ring, your character's resilience depends on two defensive properties, defense and absorption. Enemies' attacks will first go through your flat defense and then get reduced according to the percentage of absorption you have for that damage type. Your character's flat defense increases when you level up, while absorption depends on the armor you have equipped. Accessories and buffs can also affect your absorption. For example, when my character has no armor, that fire attack from a demon pyromancer deals 366 damage. But with the black iron armor set giving me a total of 169 fire defense and 31% fire absorption, the damage of the fireball is reduced to 219. Some gear like the clutch rings or sword seals reduce your absorption percentages, which makes you take significantly more damage. You also suffer reduced absorption when hit by specific effects, and you take more damage when in instability and counter damage states, which I will cover in a moment. In Dark Souls 1 and 2, absorption did not exist yet, so only defense matters. Both leveling your character and equipping armor increases defense, alongside accessories and buffs. Hostile effects will also affect your defense, such as Acid in Dark Souls 2 breaking down your armor to render it ineffective, or Calamit's Eye of Calamity grab in Dark Souls 1 doubling your damage taken. In Dark Souls 2 and Elden Ring, entities standing in water or under the rain also take less fire damage, but will receive increased lightning damage. Resistances govern your ability to endure status build-up. Once the status bar is filled, your character will suffer that status effect. This is called a status proc. Once triggered, the bar will slowly return to 0 while you suffer the status effect over time, with the exception of status effects that are instant like bleed. Leveling up your character stats or equipping gear increases your resistances to select status effects. For example, leveling Vigor in Dark Souls 3 boosts your resistance to bleed and frostbite, while leveling Mind in Elden Ring raises your resistance to sleep and madness effects. Resistances are not something you should really worry about, since your levels and armor will give you plenty of resistances, and no enemy will really require you to build a specific resistance to fight. Consumable items called mosses or boluses can also instantly cure their respective status effects upon usage. Souls games possess different damage types, which are generally identical across the series and have the same properties. They are split into two categories, physical and elemental. Damage types aren't just ways to make different builds feel unique by doing damage in different flavors. They follow a thematic consistency, being generally effective or ineffective against the same type of enemies across each game. With some exceptions aside, you can recognize patterns and tell at a glance what damage type an enemy will most likely be resistant or be weak to. Standard damage is basic physical damage, typically found in battle axes, longswords, greatswords, or any weapon sporting a more generic moveset. Standard damage is generally good against everything, with the exception of armored enemies or creatures with hard skin. Strike damage is typically found in hammers, great hammers, clubs, and fist weapons. Strike damage is strong against armored enemies, creatures with stone skin, and skeletons, and is effective at breaking the guards of shields, but will not do much against supple armor or hide. Slash damage is typically found in curved swords, katanas, and scythes. Slash damage is good against enemies with exposed skin or thin clothing, but ineffective against armored enemies and scaled creatures. Thrust damage is typically found in spears, halberds, thrusting swords, and arrows shot from bows or crossbows. Thrust damage excels against creatures with scales and is good against some armored enemies. Piercing attacks also benefit from the counter damage mechanic. Something important to note about physical damage types is that just because a weapon is stated to deal a specific damage type doesn't mean that damage type will be automatically applied to all of its attacks. Instead, it depends on the specific animation of each attack. For example, a claymore does standard damage on most attacks, but its heavy attack is a stab, which does thrust damage as a result. An S-stock does thrust damage on most attacks, but its heavy attack is a swipe, which deals standard damage. This rule doesn't apply to elemental damage types, which are imbued to all attacks of an elemental weapon. Magic damage is typically found in weapons infused with magic, intelligence-based weapons, and sorceries. Magic damage is usually effective against armored enemies and physical resistant enemies, but ineffective against magic-wielding enemies or enemies created by magic. Fire damage is typically found in weapons infused with fire, faith and intelligence-based weapons, and pyromancies or fire sorceries. Fire damage is effective against enemies without armor, beasts, plants, and abyssal unwrought creatures, but is weak against heavily armored enemies, demons, and dragons. Lightning damage is typically found in weapons infused with lightning, phase-based weapons, and miracles and incantations. In Elden Ring, lightning is also associated with dexterity weapons. Lightning damage is effective against enemies wearing metal armor, and in older Souls games is also strong against dragons, but is ineffective against stone enemies or enemies wielding lightning. Lightning spells and projectiles also propagate on water in an area of effect. Dark damage is featured in Dark Souls 2 and Dark Souls 3. Dark damage is typically found in weapons infused with dark, faith and intelligence-based weapons, and abyssal weapons and spells. Dark damage is strong against godkin enemies and demons, but weak against undead and enemies corrupted by the abyss. In Elden Ring, holy damage replaced dark damage. Holy damage is typically found in sacred-infused weapons, faith-based weapons, and incantations. Holy damage is strong against undead and unholy enemies, but ineffective against sacred enemies and members of the Golden Lineage, which unfortunately includes most of the main story bosses. Some sources of holy damage also prevent skeletons from rising again. In Dark Souls 1, divine and occult damage are bonus effects that respectively increase damage against unholy and divine enemies. Divine damage also prevents skeletons from resurrecting themselves. Note that the majority of elemental weapons will have their damage split between physical and elemental, with only few purely elemental weapons across the series. This sometimes makes them less effective to use, since they have to go through both physical and elemental defenses. Unless you boost their damage with scaling or buffs, or exploit an enemy's weakness to maximize the damage dealt after penetrating flat defenses. This makes triple split damage weapons such as the infamous Dancer's Blades in Dark Souls 3 quite weak, unless you put a lot of effort into building them optimally. Successive R1 inputs with melee weapons will perform a chain of light attacks. Dark Souls games and Elden Ring handle R1 melee chains quite differently. In Elden Ring, most melee weapon classes will have a 5 hits R1 chain, with the last attack of the chain always being a finisher with higher recovery. How many R1s each chain has depends on how heavy the weapon class is, down to 3 hits R1 chains for colossal weapons. In older Souls games, R1 chains are only composed of 2 attacks that can be chained seamlessly as long as you have stamina to attack. This led to the infamous R1 spam meta in DS3, since spamming light attack in that game is vastly better DPS than any other combat option. When using ranged weapons, R1 will shoot using the ammo type in your primary ammo slot. You do not have R1 chains and will instead perform a single R1 animation over and over. When using spellcasting tools in your main hand, R1 will cast a spell you have currently selected. In Elden Ring, faster spells that allow quick casting will let you perform an infinite 2 casts R1 chain of that spell, until you run out of focus points or stamina points. Most spells with slower animations do not allow for quick casting. Elden Ring also lets you hold the R1 button to charge most spells, taking longer to cast, but delivering higher damage and allowing for some extra complexity to spellcasting gameplay. Successive R2 inputs with melee weapons will perform a chain of heavy attacks. All melee weapon classes have a 2 hits R2 chain regardless of their speed or weight. When using ranged weapons, R2 will shoot using the ammo type in your secondary ammo slot. You do not have R2 chains and will instead perform a single R2 animation over and over. When using spellcasting tools, R2 will perform a useless melee attack with your tool, doing negligible damage. There is no point in ever using this. Holding down the R2 button with a melee weapon in Dark Souls 3 and Elden Ring will extend the wind-up animation of the attack and deliver a much more powerful blow, dealing increased damage, stance damage, and poise damage. Releasing the button at any point before the attack is fully charged will return a normal R2 instead, which allows you to cancel your attack early if you notice it will miss, or the enemy will reach you before it gets fully charged. Charge heavies have increased Hyperarmor, making them a powerful tool to get an advantageous trade with an enemy. Dark Souls 1 and Dark Souls 2 do not feature charge heavy attacks. Weapon skills are powerful standalone moves using focus points, and bound to a weapon either naturally by being its default skill when obtaining the weapon, or crafted to a smithing stone weapon using the Ashes of War system in Elden Ring. Weapon skills come in 5 different categories. Those range from movement skills, stealth skills, or defense skills, all the way to parry skills like standard parry, or spells and projectiles parries. Skills that either increase your overall battle performance, or coat the weapon with a flat damage or status buff. Single move attack, which is performed as soon as you press the button, similarly to a regular attack. Enter a stance and press R1 or R2 to perform either of two follow-ups, or cancel the stance if you decide not to do the follow-ups. Press for an initial attack with the option of a second input to follow up with another attack. The main source of damage is usually the second part of the skill, with the first hit acting as a way to stun your foe into the big blow, while letting you cancel early if you change your mind. While skills are mostly common to Dark Souls 3 and Elden Ring, Dark Souls 1 and Dark Souls 2 did possess a primitive version of skills tied to the heavy attack of some specific weapons. As a side note, a lot of weapons across the series bestow passive effects, on top of hidden damage modifiers I mentioned earlier. Those range from providing health or magic regeneration, increasing stats or resistances, increasing enemies' drops, or providing utility bonuses, so make sure to always check the descriptions of items you just acquired. Sprinting is your main horizontal mobility tool, allowing you to move at a higher speed in the direction your character is facing as long as you hold the button. A sprinting R1 or sprinting R2 can be performed during the sprinting animation, with unique animations depending on the weapon. Sprinting R2s in Dark Souls games are kind of awkward, locking you in a mini jump attack which has instability damage frames. Elden Ring got rid of those jumps in favor of better sprinting R2s, and given instability damage doesn't exist in this game, they've become a very viable combat option. Due to sprinting and rolling sharing the same button, and rolls being performed when releasing the button, it is difficult to do a quick dodge while sprinting. If you run out of stamina while sprinting, your character won't be able to sprint again for a couple seconds. To avoid this, stop sprinting briefly as your stamina runs low to let it regenerate a bit, then start again to maintain continuous speed. Suddenly changing directions while sprinting can cause your character to pivot while readjusting their footing. Pivoting is very detrimental as it will lock you in place for a good second. It's even worse in Dark Souls 1 and 3, where pivoting exposes your character to instability damage during the animation. However, blocking while sprinting completely negates the pivot mechanic, making it much safer and easier to sprint around. Dodge rolling is your main evasion tool, making your character perform a rolling animation in the direction of your choice, and providing invulnerability frames, also known as iframes. You get iframes for short duration at the start of your dodge, allowing you to roll through attacks without getting hit. The invulnerability window lasts under half a second, and the second part of the animation is open to damage. A rolling R1 can be performed at the end of the roll with unique animations depending on the weapon. There are no specific rolling R2s, a regular R2 will be done instead. Your dodge effectiveness depends on your current equip load. Equip load is the total weight of your currently equipped gear. Different equip load thresholds influence the iframes of your roll as detailed in these datasheets. Your equip load also affects your dodge distance and stamina regeneration. Under 30% equipment load, your rolls have extended distance and you can recover from backstabs faster. Between 30% and 70% equipment load, your roll has a normal distance. Between 70% and 100% equipment load, your rolls have reduced distance, backstabs have increased recovery, and your stamina regeneration is decreased by 20%. Above 100% equipment load, you are unable to roll or backstab, and pressing roll will instead play a struggle animation, leaving you open to damage. You can no longer sprint, and your walking animation is reduced to a slow walk. It is commonly considered that Souls games are balanced around medium load, with light load providing advantages like getting out of intended wall-catching attacks due to the higher roll distance, while heavy and over-encumbered loads are to be avoided at all costs. Iframes is short for invulnerability frames, the game's intended way to avoid numerous forms of damage. Iframes are mostly accessible with dodge rolls, specific weapon skills, parrying, performing or receiving a critical attack or grab, getting up from the ground, interacting with some world elements, and lastly, mounting and dismounting torrent in Elden Ring. Recovery rolls are a recovery tool when finding yourself prone on the ground. It allows you to stand up faster and prevents you from getting hit again while on the ground. A recovery roll has a higher amount of iframes compared to a regular roll. Recovery walls are not available if you got knocked down from torrent however, making your character dangerously vulnerable during that time. Alright, with the basics out of the way, let's dive into combat mechanics, starting with offense. Souls combat possesses different fighting styles with dedicated movesets depending on how you wield your weapons. The most simple and versatile melee style, one-handing offers quick attacks and leaves your offhand free. This allows you to wield a shield, a casting tool or another weapon. A more committing style, two-handed attacks are slower but have higher modifiers of damage, stun and poise damage, on top of having increased Hyperarmor, which makes them easier to trade blows with. Two-handing also virtually increases your strength by 1.5 across all Souls games, letting you wield weapons you weren't able to meet the strength requirement for otherwise. For example, a weapon requiring 30 strength can be wielded with only 20 strength if you two-hand it. Specific paired weapons use a single equipment slot but are equipped in each hand when two-handed, enabling a series of simultaneous attacks with both weapons by pressing L1 while still having access to L1 movesets with your main hand. This enables continuous onslaughts of attacks for very high damage outputs, but those weapons lose the ability to block, trading this defensive option for increased aggression. In Elden Ring, paired weapons have their controls modified to instead perform paired attacks with R1s, no longer giving you the option of doing single-hand R1s when dual wielding. However, this means that they can still use L1 to block. Those weapons also possess unique R2s using both weapons to hit, compared to dual-wielded weapons from older games or power stance weapons using only your right-hand weapon for R2 attacks. In Dark Souls 2 and Elden Ring, holding two melee weapons of the same type in each hand will enable dual-wielding attacks using both weapons. Most melee weapon classes will have a 3 to 4 hits dual-wielded chain depending on weapon class. Power stancing uses the dual-wielding rules of older Souls games, meaning L1s will perform dual-wielded attacks while R1s and R2s use the one-handed moveset of your right-hand weapon. This also means that power stance weapons cannot block. Power stancing weapons offers high damage output and great versatility with the options of switching between dual wielding, one-handed and two-handed movesets on the fly, if you don't mind losing the ability to block. Each Souls game offers the ability to mix and match different weapon types together, giving you the option to either attack with your main hand weapon or with your offhand weapon. Some off-handed weapons will perform a parry, but most will do a light attack chain. This is different from both dual wielding and power stance, and offers far less options. This can come in useful to mix up between quick and slow attacks, but is not a very common playstyle as a whole. Dark Souls 2, being the pioneer of the multiple weapons fighting style, possesses the unique ability to perform strong attacks not only with your right hand weapon, but also with your left hand weapon, as well as a double weapon strong attack if your character is power stancing. This gives the Bearer of the Curse one of the most versatile movesets of the Souls series. You can perform a plunge attack when dropping onto enemies from above by pressing R1 in other Souls games and R1 or R2 in Elden Ring. It does high damage but requires precision to land. Plunge attacks do not protect you from fall damage yourself. Some enemies are particularly weak to plunge attacks, with dedicated critical animations, making them typically a one-shot kill on that enemy. Players, as well as the majority of enemies, take increased damage when hit on the head. The bonus damage multiplier is typically 50%, although some enemies suffer higher damage or will take reduced damage instead. Headshots on humanoid enemies will typically trigger a special stun animation independent of Poise or Hyperarmor values, even on bosses and of course on the player itself. When the conditions align, this animation can even be looped to stun lock a foe, which is pretty funny. Headshots can occasionally stun even non-humanoid enemies. Headshots will commonly be caused by projectiles like scoped bowshots, although it's sometimes possible to land headshot hits with melee weapons as well. A lot of enemies will generally take bonus damage to the head even when hit with melee attacks and spells, especially large enemies or bosses. When an enemy or player performs an attack animation, they enter a counter damage state. How much bonus damage they take in counter state depends on the game. In Dark Souls 1, they will take an additional 20% thrusting damage. In Dark Souls 2, they will take bonus damage from any attack type depending on the counter damage multiplier of that weapon. Counter states also last significantly longer than in other games, making counter attacks easy to land to melt down bosses. In Dark Souls 3 and Elden Ring, their absorption versus thrust damage is reduced by 30%. Using a heavy piercing weapon like a Great Spear is even better to interrupt the enemy's attack while dealing high counter damage. In Dark Souls 1 and Dark Souls 3, a player or enemy entering an instability state will suffer 40% more damage. Many situations cause an entity to enter instability state, for both enemies and players being parried, getting guard broken, having their attack bounce off a wall or heavy shield, for players and player type enemies only, recovering from a long fall, pivoting while sprinting, getting hit during a jump attack or running attack, or trying to roll while overloaded all cause instability damage. In Dark Souls 3, getting Poise broken can render specific enemies vulnerable to instability damage while they are staggered. In Dark Souls games, specific weapon classes such as scythes and halberds have a sweet spot mechanic, where hitting with the blade part of the weapon will do higher damage than hitting with the handle. This rewards good spacing relative to your enemy, though the damage difference is rather small, roughly a 10% damage difference. This could make a difference if you land the sweet spot hits repeatedly over a long boss fight, but for most encounters it won't matter too much. All Souls games feature status effects as an auxiliary damage mechanic. Like I mentioned in the Resistances section, the way status effects work is quite simple. Once the status bar is fully built up, the status effect will trigger on the target, whether that's you or an enemy. Status effects exist in different types. Bleed inflicts a large percentage of the target's max health at once. It's a very powerful effect for aggressive playstyles to inflict repeated bursts of damage. Poison inflicts slow, continuous damage ticks over its duration. Poison is mostly useful to complement more defensive playstyles or to open a fight with before switching to your main weapon. Dark Souls 2's Poison is noticeably stronger than DS1 and DS3's counterparts, while Elden Ring also features Deadly Poison, a variant of normal poison dealing twice as much damage but lasting twice as short. Toxic inflicts high, continuous damage ticks over its duration. It has the same use as Poison, but much more vicious and harder to come by. Elden Ring's counterpart, Scarlet Rot, also features Deadly Scarlet Rot, which inflicts higher damage, and Super Scarlet Rot exclusive to Malenia, which will obliterate your health bar and keep draining you in the afterlife. Poison and Toxic can be combined to deal high damage over time. Introduced in Dark Souls 3, Frostbite inflicts a small percentage of the target's max health instantly, and applies a debuff for its duration. While often underused in favor of Bleed, it's ideal to prime your target and inflict massive damage through its weakened absorptions. Taking fire damage will remove the Frostbite effect for both enemies and players. Cold Petrification in DS2 and Deathblight in Elden Ring, Curse instantly kills the target upon triggering. It also cuts your health in half upon respawning in Dark Souls 1. Being such a strong effect, only a few enemies can inflict Curse on the player, and only 4 sources of Curse are available to the player, all found in Elden Ring. It is a vastly useless status effect for players, as it only works in PvP, since everything else is immune to its effect, including other player type NPCs like Gideon or Leda's Gang, where it could have been useful. In Elden Ring, Sleep stuns the target for more or less time depending on the target type. Most enemies will fall asleep for 60 seconds until hit and be exposed to critical riposte. Elite enemies and player type NPCs will be stunned for a couple seconds only. When inflicted on the player, Sleep will cause a 2-second stun and drain focus points. Targets that were briefly stunned by Sleep suffer increased knockback during the stun animation. Eternal Sleep, a stronger variant introduced in a DLC, puts weaker enemies to sleep permanently even if hit, but won't offer a critical riposte. It also allows to hit sleep-susceptible bosses for 5 seconds before reverting to regular sleep. And when inflicted on the player, Eternal Sleep will only inflict a stronger drain of focus points. In Elden Ring, Madness stuns the target for a couple seconds, inflicting damage and draining your focus points. Targets afflicted with Madness will also suffer increased stun during the Madness animation. Madness only affects player-type NPCs, but unlike Deathblight, it does work against NPC bosses and is even quite effective. In Elden Ring, enemies and bosses gain increased resistances to a status effect each time this effect is triggered on them, making it for example harder to bleed an enemy repeatedly. Status resistance eventually caps after increasing to a maximum of 5 times depending on the enemy. This resistance scaling can be a big problem if status effects are key to your strategy in a boss fight, for example using Freezing Pause to bypass Malenia's Waterfall Dance. Since Freezing Pause deals 380 frost buildup, this trick will only work twice across the entire boss fight, and attempting it a third time will result in a nasty surprise. Note that most bosses with a second phase that use a different entity model, like Malikes or the Fire Giant, will reset their resistances when they go into phase 2, since you're technically facing a new enemy. Climbing a ladder renders you exposed to enemies. If you get hit on a ladder, you'll suffer heavy stamina damage, and if you run out of stamina, your character will fall off the ladder to their potential death. If an enemy follows you on a ladder, pressing R1 or R2 lets you return the favor with punches and kicks. Horseback Combat is a new mechanic introduced in Elden Ring, allowing us to fight on the back of our trusty steed Torrent. Although not a major part of the combat system, it does have its uses. Torrent himself doesn't have invincibility frames per se, although the dash he does when he starts galloping can be used to dodge attacks situationally. Stationary mounting and dismounting animations provide iframes to make mounted combat more viable. However, mounting and dismounting while sprinting triggers different animations without iframes. Pressing R1 and L1 performs a light attack on the right and left side of your horse respectively. Pressing R2 and L2 performs a heavy attack on the right and left side of your horse respectively. Holding the R2 or L2 buttons performs a charge attack with a continuous hitbox, damaging and stunning enemies before the final blow. While jumping, you can perform light attacks on either side of Torrent. While on horseback, you can also use certain spells and ranged attacks. Some unique weapons like the Smith's Cube Cirque can also be thrown from horseback. Torrent doesn't have defenses, and if he is hit by too many attacks in a row, he will get stance broken and disappear, knocking you to the ground. This is why some enemies like the Torch Wandering Noble are so fearsome despite doing little actual damage. Certain enemies will detect when you're riding Torrent and will specifically try to dismount you with high stagger attacks before rushing in for a dismount critical riposte. Additionally, Torrent can die if his health is depleted, requiring you to consume a flask of Crimson Tears to revive him. You can also heal him before he dies by using your flask of Crimson Tears or special consumables like the Roba Fruits. When mounted on Torrent, the input for two-handing your weapon instead switches the weapon your character holds. Because of this, you need to make sure to two-hand any weapon you cannot wield one-handed before hopping on Torrent. However, note that two-handing your weapon before hopping on Torrent will not change the speed of your hits or the damage you inflict. Backsteps are a secondary evasion tool, making your character perform a backstep animation in the opposite direction your character is facing. Backsteps provide short iframes in Dark Souls 1, decent iframes in Dark Souls 2, but do not provide iframes in Dark Souls 3 and Elden Ring. Backsteps also travel less distance than walls and have shorter recovery, allowing for a quick retaliation with either a backstep R1 using the same animation as the sprinting R1 of your weapon, or a backstep R2 using the same animation as the regular R2 of your weapon. Backsteps are globally useless outside of DS2, they will just get you hit and are worse than rolling in 99% of scenarios when it comes to iframing attacks. However, in Dark Souls 2 and Elden Ring, you can keep blocking during a backstep, which allows you to protect yourself if you fail to space an attack with your backstep. In Elden Ring, backsteps can be given iframes if you use either the Fine Crucible Feather or the Talisman of all Crucibles, making them an effective dodge tool but at the cost of a high absorption debuff, which I do not believe is worth the risk for general gameplay. In Dark Souls games, jumping is useful for closing horizontal gaps or directing your fall. They don't provide you with any verticality, so you cannot use them to climb ledges. If you hold any movement direction while sprinting, your character will perform a wall at the end of your jump with iframes. If you don't, you will land in a neutral stance instead. In Elden Ring, however, jumping is your main tool for vertical mobility, easing your exploration of the world by letting you climb up and down ledges and obstacles, jump across gaps, etc. Jumping is also a useful combat option, disabling the hitbox of the lower half of your body to avoid attacks from enemies and area of effect affecting the ground. The iframes period of the jump animation lasts almost a full second. Some attacks are clearly designed to be jumped rather than dodged, but you will find jumping is generally effective on a vast amount of attacks, including some where it really should not work. Be careful when jumping slam attacks, however, since while you can jump the AoE itself, you can still get hit by the enemy's body or the weapon hitbox of the attack if it makes contact with your upper body. A jumping R1 or jumping R2 can be performed while in the air with unique animations depending on the weapon. Jumping attacks to increase stance damage compared to regular R1s and R2s. Some spells can also be cast from a jumping motion. Jumps have an annoying side mechanics tied to them, where jumping twice in a row will give the second jump a much shorter range and momentum. This is called baby jumps, and probably cause the loss of many tarnished trying to cross gaps. The best way to combat this is using another animation between each jump, preventing the second jump from being downgraded. The easiest way to do so is by blocking with your weapon or shield. A quick tip for jumping before we continue. If you struggle during a parkour section due to overshooting jumps, be sure to direct your jump towards the wall to stop your momentum and secure your landing. Exclusive to Elden Ring, crouching is your main tool for stealth. Crouching makes you harder to detect by enemies and muffles your footsteps. It also lowers your character's hitbox, allowing you to duck some attacks, although it is probably not intended to be used as a direct combat tool. A crouching R1 can be performed from that position with unique animations depending on the weapon. There are no specific crouching R2s, your character will instantly stand up for a normal R2 instead. Some actions like drinking flasks can be done while crouched. Crouching is also useful for animation cancels, but more on that later. Hold L1 to enter a guarding stance with your shield or melee weapon. If hit in that stance, your shield will absorb the hit, and its damage will be mitigated in proportion to the shield or weapon's guard absorption values. Blocking an attack will also drain stamina points in proportion to the shield or weapon's guard boost value. Beware that holding guard will slow down your stamina regeneration greatly. If you run out of stamina, you will be guard broken, which will expose you to a critical attack from some enemies and other players. Aside from exceptions like colossal weapons having high guard absorption values, shields typically excel at blocking over weapons, which should only be used for blocking as a last recourse action. Small shields tend to have poor blocking capabilities and are mostly used for utility like parries. Medium shields offer solid versatility, and great shields are masters at blocking but cannot parry and weigh heavily as a counterbalance. Quick note, physical damage is great to block since it will often be 100% absorbed, but elemental damage always chips through blocking, making it still dangerous. Weaker attacks from light weapons or lesser enemies will bounce off of shields when blocking, flinching the enemy for an opportunity to counterattack. Thrusting swords, heavy thrusting swords, spears and great spears can simultaneously attack while blocking with a special animation. This is referred to as shield poking. After blocking a hit in Elden Ring, pressing R2 will perform a guard counter, a special move inflicting high stance damage which varies with your weapon type. Some weapons like DS3's Valor Heart or Elden Ring's Dueling Shields have blocking frames on their attacks, meaning they will block incoming damage while attacking in the same attack motion. Shields will only block hits if the enemy or player is visibly guarding with them. Having a shield passively at your side or on your back will not block anything. Same goes for attacks, with some attacks raising the shield and providing blocking frames, but most of them don't. Additionally, blocking will only protect you from attacks that visibly hit your shield. Area of effect attacks erupting from beneath your feet or attacks reaching behind your shield will not be blocked. Similarly, any effect which is applied on hits will not be blocked, such as grab attacks, status effects build-up, or unique effects like Malenia's lifesteal. Some weapons, like Scythes, have the unique properties of dealing chip damage through shields. As a player, you can of course use that to your advantage, but also use skills like Impaling Thrust to pierce right through an enemy's shield. Elden Ring's DLC, Shadow of the Erdtree, added a new deflecting mechanic with the Deflecting Crystal tier, loosely based on the very refined deflection system of Sekiro Shadow's Die Twice. This allows you to considerably reinforce the guard boost of your equipped shield or weapon when blocking right before getting hit by an attack. The timing is even tighter than parries, but the reward is very high. On top of reducing the stamina consumption from guarding and negating all physical damage and most elemental damage from the incoming attack, deflecting will increase the HP and stance damage of your next guard counter. This buff stacks up to 4 tiers, each providing a 20% boost for a total of 80% more HP and stance damage. Parrying is a utility skill commonly found in small and medium shields, but also some weapons like parrying daggers and katanas, or as a hidden skill of some weapons when wielded in your offhand. Pressing the weapon skill button as an attack is about to connect will parry it, interrupting the attack and staggering the enemy. Most enemies and mini-bosses will be open to a critical attack after being parried, although, starting with Elden Ring, some bosses can take 2 parries or even 3 parries before being staggered. A couple enemies can even be parried while charging at the player and will be knocked out of the way. You typically cannot parry 200 attacks from colossal weapons, and you cannot parry shields and whips. Most larger enemies or bosses cannot be parried at all. Successfully landing a parry will negate the incoming damage entirely. However, missing the timing of a parry will instead block the hit with the health and stamina drain that come with it, although the player will not be stunned. This is called partial parries. The most important part about landing parries is remembering that you need to parry the hand of the enemy attacking you. Even for weapon attacks, the parrying hitbox will always be around the hand and won't extend to the blade part. So stick as close to the enemy as possible for your parries to succeed. Don't think that parries are exclusive to our player character. Obviously, some other player type NPCs can parry if they have a shield or a parry tool equipped, but some rare enemies also have the ability to parry you. This is recognizable when they enter a special stance, or as part of the gimmick of some fights. To play around an NPC with the ability to auto-parry, make sure to use attacks classified as unparryable, such as jump R2s in Elder Souls or jumping attacks in Elden Ring. Colossal weapons wielded two-handed are also unparryable, aside from a couple moves like rolling attacks. Alternatively, you can parry them yourself and give them a taste of their own medicine. In older Dark Souls games, inflicting enough poise damage by repeatedly hitting an enemy will deplete an invisible poise bar until they get poise broken. The resulting stagger typically allows for 1 or 2 extra hits before they recover, although staggering a mini-boss or boss can also allow for a critical riposte. However, if the enemy isn't hit and so doesn't suffer poise damage again for a few seconds, that poise meter will completely refill and the progress towards the stagger will be lost. For example, Nameless King in Dark Souls 3 has 215 poise, and if he's not hit during 13 seconds, his poise is restored completely. Dark Souls 2 was the first game to introduce the ability to open some enemies to a critical attack by staggering them. This, however, seems to be exclusive to colossal weapons and only work on a couple enemies. Given weaker enemies suffer knockdown stuns when hit by the same attack, and hitting enemies repeatedly with lighter weapons also doesn't work, the conditions for this poise break to trigger seem to be a high-level stun in one single blow. In Dark Souls 3, staggers are tied to 2 different systems. The first one is the usual poise break system, where the resulting stagger either opens up the boss for a critical attack, or they might simply get stunned for a couple seconds. A new third scenario also exists, where a staggered boss can become susceptible to instability damage while in the stagger state, for that lovely 40% bonus damage I've mentioned earlier. Some bosses also possess infinite poise, and cannot be stunned or staggered by any means possible. That second system is centered around weak points, also called limb breaking. While cutting enemies' parts to get special loot or tactical advantage already existed in previous games, Bloodborne and Dark Souls 3 gave limb breaking a more prevalent gameplay role, with the ability to stagger a boss or mini-boss and open them for critical riposte. This is done by storing enough HP damage into a specific part of some enemies until it breaks and staggers them. This method is based on health thresholds, so depending on the value required, you might get multiple limb breaks or only get them once per fight. Unless you heal your target, then do it again, although I don't know who would be foolish enough to do such a thing. That system allows you to take your time. Since there's no pressure of a timer to get the stagger, it is guaranteed to happen once you've accumulated enough damage. Some variants of weak points only need a certain stun level to be applied, or need the enemy to get hit during certain conditions. Stance is Elden Ring's fundamental equivalent of Poise. All enemies and bosses can be stance broken, with the exception of player-type NPCs who follow player Poise rules instead. Once an enemy's stance meter reaches 0, the enemy will be stance broken and fall to the ground. Stance breaks yield critical attack opportunities the majority of the time, though some enemies like dogs or slimes will flatten on the ground for a couple seconds instead. Stance broken enemies suffer a 20% damage bonus during the stagger animation. It's recommended to hit them a couple times for bonus damage before taking the critical attack. CR2s and jumping R2s are the most effective attacks at damaging enemy stance, alongside many weapon skills. Stance meters start to regenerate when the enemy hasn't been hit for a while. Instead of completely refilling once the timer is over like in older Souls games, the stance meter slowly regenerates over time. The higher the stance health of an enemy, the longer it takes to start regenerating, with roughly 1 second per 13 stance. For example, a 30 stance enemy like a foot soldier starts to regenerate after 2.3 seconds. An 80 stance enemy like Morgoth starts to regenerate after 6 seconds. A 120 stance enemy like R3 avatars start to regenerate after 9 seconds. The DLC final boss, Promised Consort Radahn, is a notorious cheater of this system, having 120 stance yet regenerating after 6 seconds only. FromSoft, please fix. Before we move on, just a few important notes regarding Poise and Stance. I'm going to use Poise as a common term here for clarity, since Poise and Stance are the same system with a different name. Poise damage is independent from a weapon's upgrade level. A +0 straight sword and a +25 straight sword will inflict the same amount of Poise damage, despite the HP damage dealt being different. I will link a sheet containing motion values and Poise damage values of every weapon in the games in the description, for those of you who are curious about it. Staggered enemies don't take Poise damage until they start to stand back up again. Critical attacks such as a riposte from a parry or a backstab do not deal Poise damage, which means they also don't reset the regen timer. So if you're close to breaking an enemy's Poise, don't go for those attacks, or they'll likely regenerate while in the critical attack animation. If you struggle at preventing a boss from recovering their stance, use quick projectiles like throwing knives. They do negligible damage, but will refresh a Poise timer, delaying the boss from regenerating it if you don't have a good window to hit. Under some conditions, bosses can ignore Poise breaks, typically when interrupting their current animation would cause some jank. I will touch more on that when talking about Hyperarmor. Special cinematic attack grabbing the enemy or player and inflicting heavy damage. From the moment the critical attack animation is started, it cannot be cancelled nor its damage avoided. It also provides iframes to both parties throughout the entire animation, preventing them from being affected by external factors like enemy attacks or heals from allies. Critical attacks are not to be confused with actual grab attacks. which are unique attacks mostly exclusive to enemies and bosses, with the exception of some player weapon skills or spells. To execute a critical attack, you need to R1 with a melee weapon into the crit hitbox of the enemy. Elden Ring gives you a sign guiding you where to hit, but in older Souls games you have to guess where the critical hitbox would be, which is typically the enemy's head or other exposed parts. Only a neutral R1 will count for the crit. Spamming follow-up R1s or using any other attack will not work. Most bosses can be hit before taking a riposte for extra damage. This is 3 damage on the majority of bosses, although some will be flinched out of the staggered animation, making you miss out on the critical attack. For example, Parrying Champion Gundyr puts him in both an instability state and a critical state, so you can intentionally hit him without taking the critical riposte a couple times before going for the crit. Player type NPCs will always get flinched if you hit them normally instead of taking the critical attack. After the critical attack is performed, enemies will be forced into a standing up animation, allowing you to prepare a CR2 or slow heavy hitting spell to hit them right as their invulnerability period expires. This is called a wake up hit. Critical attacks account for the critical multiplier of your weapon, so having a pocket dagger to switch to for crits is usually the best choice, given their lightweight and high crit damage multiplier. Critical attacks can occur in the following scenarios. A stance break allows for critical riposte, inflicting the highest damage out of all crits, or a critical backstab which inflicts less damage on some enemies or bosses which cannot be normally backstabbed. Poise breaks or limb breaks in older Souls sometimes allow for critical riposte. Parries open up the enemy for critical riposte in both PvE and PvP. Guard breaks also open up the enemy for critical riposte in both PvE and PvP. Note that despite both stance breaks and parries giving the same critical riposte animation, their trigger conditions are independent, which means if you've been building up parries on a boss, stance breaking them and taking the critical riposte will not reset the parries count, and vice versa. Given that you usually get a CR2 opening when an enemy stands up from a riposte, you can make the life of some bosses like Margit absolutely miserable by alternating between stance breaks and parries on repeat. Regular backstabs work a bit differently from critical backstabs. They don't require enemies to be staggered and can be performed at any time mid-combat. Backstabs work in 2 parts. First, the initial attack, where you attempt to grab the enemy's back. If this connects, you and the enemy enter the proper grab animation with iframes, and your character deals massive damage to the enemy. However, that initial attack can miss, so if the enemy moves away from you in time, a failed backstab animation will play instead, which will leave you vulnerable to damage. Funnily enough, the failed grab attempt is considered an attack, and will still do minor damage if it hits something outside of their backstab hitbox. Humanoid enemies like soldiers are easy to circle around and backstab, although not all of them can be backstabbed. Some enemies are coded to try and counter backstabs, but you can still get them with enough perseverance. Note that backstabs cannot be taken on moving grounds like elevators, or if the enemy is in a flinching animation, so wait a second before attempting a backstab if your co-op partner or NPC summon just flinched that enemy. All player type NPCs as well as some enemies can also backstab players, so be careful about turning your back on enemies. Stealth allows you to make yourself harder to detect by enemies and enables sneak attacks. Sneak attacks do a bonus 20% HP and stance damage to enemies that haven't noticed you yet. For example here, a stealth CR2 with the Fire Knight's greatsword deals 48.5 stance damage to that giant crow. Meanwhile, the same CR2 in regular combat deals 39.6 stance damage, so a 20% difference. Stealthing is made easier by crouching, or with tools such as the Assassin's Gambit weapon skill or the spells like Unseen Form and Darkness. The way stealth effects work is by reducing enemies' detection radius. If I use a tool to visualize enemies' detection and apply Assassin's Gambit, you can see how the enemy's vision shrinks. If I then crouch, it reduces even more. This can allow for some funny situations, such as sneaking around Morgoth and poison misting him to death, though it only works for a handful of boss fights. It's however a very powerful tool for general exploration, or for getting from point A to point B unbothered. Poise is an invisible bar that protects the player or player type NPC from being flinched when taking a hit. Each hit will lower that poise bar until it runs out and the player gets flinched, stunning them for a short duration and generally interrupting their actions. Player or NPC poise is independent from PvE poise or stance. Lightly armored NPCs and players have low poise and will flinch from receiving a hit from even light weapons. More heavily armored NPCs and players typically have high poise and will tank a few hits from most weapons outside of heavier weapon classes. In Dark Souls 1 and Dark Souls 2, medium to heavy armors allow players to passively tank most attacks without being flinched, with Dark Souls 2 also providing active poise, known as Hyperarmor, to heavier attacks to make them harder to interrupt. Dark Souls 3 ditched the passive poise system to exclusively focus on the Hyperarmor system, sparking a lot of confusion about poise being turned off. Elden Ring reintroduced passive poise to a lesser extent, but still favors Hyperarmor as the most accessible way to avoid being flinched from attacks. Some gear, consumables or abilities across Souls games help increase the poise damage you deal or your own character's poise. Enemies in Souls games are also subject to flinching, interrupting their current action or attack depending on the strength of the attack that hits them, which is different from a poise or stance break. For example, the majority of normal enemies in Dark Souls games cannot be poise broken, only flinched. Meanwhile, most Elden Ring enemies can be both flinched and stance broken. Larger creatures and armored enemies typically won't get flinched by weaker weapons, regardless of how many times you hit them with one, but they can be poise or stance broken. Colossal enemies and major bosses typically won't get flinched by anything. So stun levels represent how hard a player or enemy will be flinched from receiving a hit. Different stun levels will inflict different kinds of stun animations. A very light stun is a 16 frame stun, typically from the lightest weapons and smallest creatures. They are easily mitigated with poise or Hyperarmor. A light stun is a 20 frame stun, typically from light weapons or small creatures. They are also easily mitigated with poise or Hyperarmor. Most elite enemies and bosses will ignore light stuns, making them more difficult to manage since you cannot interrupt their actions. A medium stun is a 50 frame stun, typically from medium weapons and medium-sized creatures. Those require higher poise or Hyperarmor values to mitigate. A heavy stun is a 70 frame stun, typically from heavy weapons and large creatures. Those can only be mitigated by the strongest poise or Hyperarmor values. As a general rule, different attacks within the same weapon will have various levels of stun. For example, R1s from a longsword will inflict light stun, while R2s will do a medium stun. Meanwhile, the Smith's Crypt Dagger is the only weapon in Elden Ring to possess 0 stun on its R1's attacks, further cementing itself as the worst weapon in this game. Next up is Stumble, another 70 frame stun. Kicking or shoving an enemy can make them stumble, which is a unique animation with the length of a heavy stun. Most light poise enemies can be kicked out of their animations but won't stumble. This mechanic is mostly used by enemies against the player. Player poise cannot mitigate shoves, but Hyperarmor can. In Dark Souls 1 and Dark Souls 3, entities in a stumble animation are also exposed to instability damage. It's also possible to suffer a stumble animation if you get hit by the very edge of hitboxes from colossal weapons or attacks, which have a stun AoE slightly larger than the damaging hitbox itself. Knockdown stuns knock the enemy or player completely on their back for 186 frames, typically from CR2s of heavy or colossal weapons, powerful weapon skills, and the strongest hits of large enemies. Pancake stuns flatten the enemy or player completely on their stomach for 108 frames. Space Program stuns uppercut the player or enemy into the air for 168 frames. knockdown, pancake and space program stuns won't ragdoll large enemies, but they will play a special stun animation to convey just how powerful of a blow you just dealt. This allows for some fun interactions with enemies you otherwise cannot flinch, like repeatedly interrupting the Draconic Sentinel out of its lightning discharge attack, or taking Loretta for a walk across her arena. While knocked on the ground from these stuns, players and player-type enemies will have a short invulnerability period, but then will be exposed to further hits as they stand up again. Those stuns cannot be mitigated by Poise or Hyperarmor. However, most can be resisted to with Superarmor, with the exception of a few attacks that seem to force a knockdown no matter what. Players and player-type enemies can use a recovery roll to cancel that vulnerability period. Some enemies can also detect when they are getting flinched on repeat and perform Hyperarmor moves to keep you from stun-locking them. Hyperarmor is a special Poise effect triggered during attack animations and preventing interruptions from flinching. Heavier and powerful attacks such as weapon skills or charge attacks tend to have high Hyperarmor values, making them difficult to interrupt compared to a light attack. Lighter weapon classes such as daggers or straight swords do not possess Hyperarmor at all. Hyperarmor applies to both players and enemies. Whether an entity hyperarmors through an attack depends on three factors: the type of weapon they use, their innate Poise value, and the type of attack or weapon that hits them. Superarmor is a stronger variant of Hyperarmor, which prevents interruption from any amount of stun level. For players, Superarmor prevents your actions from being interrupted by Poise damage. It is obtainable through the weapon skill called Endure or Perseverance. Grab attacks and headshots will still ignore Superarmor. For enemies, Superarmor prevents their actions from being interrupted by stuns and Poise or stance breaks, even if their meter reaches 0. Superarmor is typically present on airborne movement animations to prevent jank from staggering a boss mid-air or interrupting phase transition animations. In those cases, Superarmor preventing Poise and stance breaks also has the infuriating side effect of restarting the regeneration process of the boss as if a stagger happened, robbing players off of their work of building up Poise or stance damage until that point. Malenia, Blade of Miquella, is infamous for getting Superarmor on the majority of her moves, because she wasn't already overtuned enough, making her ignore flinches and stance breaks constantly unless timed when she recovers from an attack or during her few Superarmorless moves. Even worse, she instantly starts to regenerate stuns, meaning that only 3 seconds after ignoring a stance break, she'll already have recovered half of her total stuns. However, the unique stun caused by triggering Bleed and Frost status effects will still override her Superarmor and flinch her. Funnily enough, having too much Hyperarmor or Superarmor as a player can sometimes be a drawback. Some enemy attacks have multiple or continuous hitboxes because the game expects you to be staggered by the first hit, giving you iframes against the other hitboxes. But if you don't, you will eat the entire attack for ridiculous damage. Action animations are typically made of 3 parts: wind up, active part, and recovery. This 3-part split is what prevents you or enemies from doing a continuous stream of damage by spamming attacks. Recoveries are what usually constitute most of your punish windows on enemies and bosses. The heavier the attack, the longer the recovery tends to be. Recoveries on most animations can be shortened by performing an animation cancel. The most common and intended animation cancels are attacking and rolling, which cancel out parts of attack recoveries for smoother combat. The most efficient animation cancel used by high-skill players is block cancels, holding block at the end of an attack to shorten its recovery, then immediately releasing it to move or attack again. This is also useful to break an R1 chain and reset to a neutral R1 for a critical attack. Since stamina regeneration is halted until recovery is complete, cancelling with a block or crouch also allows to start recovering stamina earlier. If I were to sum up Souls combat in one sentence, it would be: controlling the action is controlling the combat. It doesn't matter if player A is a level 1 character and this is an endgame soldier who can one-shot them, because by constantly interrupting him, they can make sure he does not get to play the game. Similarly, it doesn't matter if player B is a level 200 Elden Lord who just beat Malenia, because those 3 rats will tear them apart in a corner and they can only blame themselves for ending up in this situation. It's no coincidence that most mini-bosses, or enemies that are meant to be threatening, have high amounts of poise. This lets them dictate the flow of combat by interrupting the player's actions while not being interrupted themselves. From Software is very aware of this when designing bosses, and having bosses control the poise game while having complex movesets on top of that is what makes them such great challenges. Whenever FromSoft designs a fast and agile boss with low poise, they always give them animations with hyper or super armor that cannot be interrupted. Otherwise players will simply stunlock the boss in a corner without needing to engage with its moveset to win. Now that would be a shame, wouldn't it? You will find yourself facing all kinds of enemies in these games, with varying levels of danger. You need to evaluate the threat level of enemies and decide who to prioritize in an encounter. For example, outspace the slow-moving melee enemy to rush down the mage or archer supporting it first. That melee enemy is harmless if you don't let him get close, but the ranged enemy can hit you from anywhere, so they need to go first. Determine if an enemy is worth fighting or not. Do they seem tough to take down? Is that enemy guarding anything that you cannot obtain without killing them? Do they look unique and likely to drop a treasure item? If you're unsure of yourself and low on resources, it's best to avoid encounters that might not be worth engaging. Learn where to focus your damage. An enemy on 1 HP will still have its full moveset and damage, so you want to prioritize finishing off a wounded foe first in a 2v1 scenario to avoid facing 2 half HP enemies still fully capable of killing you. Enemies aren't the only thing eager to get you in Souls games. The environment itself will be happy to do so. Pressure plates with projectiles, explosive barrels, a surprising amount of giant balls straight out of Indiana Jones, etc. You need to learn to read the environment to avoid obvious traps. If you are currently safe, give yourself some time to trigger the traps and see what they do. That way, you'll be able to utilize them yourself to take out enemies or weaken them before closing in for the finish. Dark Souls 2 is a prime example of this, being littered with traps that you can use to your advantage. Enemies will occasionally wait for you in ambushes, items in the open acting as bait for unsuspecting players, enemies positioned around corners are scripted to attack as soon as the player gets into range, sleeping or passive enemies that get activated by the sound of the player walking by, or drop on you when you pick up an item, etc. Watch your surroundings constantly to avoid any bad surprise. Use the environment to your advantage to fight enemies on your own terms whenever possible. Lure enemies away from a tight room where they will surround you, and pick them off one by one as they try to catch up to you instead. You can use cover to deny mages or archers their range advantage and get to them, or lure them to your melee range instead. This can even be applied to some boss fights. Control the battlefield as much as you can. For example, in this fight, Malenia was sticking to the wall in the obscured part of the arena, which is no matter to her, but puts me at a disadvantage. It's harder to see, my camera might get stuck in the wall, and if she does her waterfall dance at the wrong angle, I won't have enough space to comfortably dodge it. So instead, I backed her away from the wall with throwing knives to relocate the fight to a more suitable spot for me. Know when to retreat and reposition in a blink of an eye. If you let yourself get surrounded, or you get jumped by enemies, don't panic under the surprise. Make your first reflex be to immediately back off and regroup. You can always devise a plan to re-engage those enemies after a few seconds of quiet thinking, less so if you're dead. A good practical example of the previous rule is found in the following clip. I go for a backstab on this Spear Lothric Knight, but get a surprise hit to the face by the Sword Knight. I quickly assess that both Lothric Knights are strong enemies with decent poise and have blocking capabilities, meaning I cannot quickly kill one before they shred me to pieces. I immediately decide to disengage and retreat to the staircase where I can safely heal, then keep moving away because I know the more aggressive Sword Knight will be right behind me. Having successfully separated both of them, I bait and outspace the full combo of the knight, then punish the finishing stab. My weapon can stunlock the knight, he tries to go for a stunlock breaking attack, but I stagger him out of it as well. The slower spear knight arrives just in time for me to go in and fish for a backstab, which I get the second time. Since I need to two-hand my weapon, I don't have time for a wake-up attack. I block the shield bash with my high absorption weapon, then gamble on him attacking again to interrupt with an R2, which I only do because the situation is safe. Afterwards, I get a second backstab, and that's the end of the fight. This, of course, wouldn't have been possible if I didn't create a safe retreat by clearing the previous room of its enemies first. Which brings me to my next point. You are moving through a hostile world, so one of your main priorities should be to secure safe areas while progressing. You can then retreat to it to safely heal if things get dire. Think of exploration as conquering every inch of an area as you go. No enemy left behind. Always kill all enemies on sight to avoid the risk of them creeping up on you or blocking your retreat to a safe area if caught in a difficult situation. Exceptions can be made for enemies out of your way that you know from experience won't be a problem. Always confirm the kill on an enemy. Souls games play a distinctive audio cue when finishing off an enemy. This is very useful to passively let you know the kill is secured and you can move on, even when the enemy hasn't finished its death animation. For example, in this clip, I backstab the Spearless Rick Knight for what looked to be all of its HP, then move on. But something feels off, and I quickly realize I didn't hear the killing sound, so I turn around to finish the job before the knight can stab me in the back, or sneak up on me when I'm fighting other enemies. In this other example, I time my R1s to hit each dog twice. And since I could distinctly hear both confirmation sounds, I can immediately continue progressing without wasting time to visually check if the off-camera dog died or not. We all know the pain of your camera getting stuck against the wall in the middle of a fight. The camera is your eyes, so poor camera control renders you effectively blind. Avoid cornering yourself against walls, not only because it will cut your movement options severely, but also because you might not be able to see anything other than the back of your head as you get torn to pieces. Whenever a boss gets too close to a wall, take a second to position them away from it to make the fight more comfortable. The lock-on is a powerful tool, but you don't need to constantly use it. Moving around is much easier when unlocked, since your character can move forward in any direction rather than having to keep facing the enemy you're locked onto, which reduces your mobility. So learning when to lock on and when to unlock is very useful, as well as how to alternate between both modes throughout a combat encounter. For example here, I stay locked on to control my sideways movement relative to Malicious, but then unlock to more easily walk slightly forward right and strafe the uppercut I just baited in order to get a charge attack punish. Another issue is related to how targeting works. Unless your foe has a specific weak point the game wants you to focus on, the lock-on will usually target the center point of the enemy. However, enemies in Souls games come in all shapes and sizes, and sometimes their character model is formed in a way where attacking while locked on will simply not hit them. That's where locking on shows its limitations and you're better off free aiming your attacks. For large enemies and bosses, it's generally advised to not use lock-on at all. Doing so lets you have entire control over the camera and prevents the target's large movements from making your camera spin. Being locked on can also get you killed by carrying you along if the enemy moves in an unexpected way. For example, messing up the direction of your dodge or dragging you with an enemy you've just pushed off a ledge. Quickly unlocking or not locking on near ledges will prevent a tragedy in those situations. While the camera and its lock-on are great to focus on a single enemy, they struggle when facing multiple foes, which makes ambushes and gang fights particularly dreadful. Turn the camera around during these encounters to keep an eye on all enemies simultaneously. Don't tunnel vision on a single target. The other enemy might be out of your screen, but it is still trying to kill you and will get you comboed at the first opportunity. Doing this is also useful while being chased by enemies to time your dodges. It is tempting to fearlessly charge into every enemy you see, but Souls games are not hack and slash games. Overcommitting will get you punished, and the games favor a more careful approach to enemy encounters. Your health bar is what keeps you in the game. There is no second chance or resurrection from allies. Your health points reaching 0 will send you back to the loading screen no matter what. Souls games are all about trial and error, so learning how to survive and overcome is the #1 goal to any encounter. Keep your health bar topped off all the time so you don't walk around with 50% HP, then die with plenty of flasks left. Maximize your survivability when going into a new situation. Step back to heal instead of greeding more hits to kill that enemy who can also kill you on its next attack. Play defensive when faced with an unknown foe. Prioritize undercommitting instead of overcommitting on openings to be ready to dodge the next attack. Stamina determines your ability to make actions. Never let your stamina bar run out or go into negative stamina. Consider your stamina bar as a second and equally as important health bar. If your stamina bar reaches 0, it's likely your health bar will go down shortly after. Always keep enough stamina for a roll as a safety net in combat to avoid getting caught because you could not dodge. Always level vigor to reasonable levels, even if playing a caster. This is an absolute necessity. Damage stats are significantly less important than vigor, especially in early game, where most of your damage will come from your weapon's upgrade level anyways. Putting 15 to 20 levels into offense stats might increase your damage by maybe 20%, but putting them into vigor could outright double your survivability. Be careful when using clutch rings or talismans. The damage increase they make you take is rarely worth the damage increase you get on your attacks. For Elden Ring specifically, don't equip Sorceal type talismans past mid-game. Radagon Sorceal is a popular choice for most players, but it actually stops being beneficial once you reach 35 vigor. It is only a debuff to your survivability past this level. Learn the limits of possibilities of your movesets and actions. Test every move of your weapon. You might find it has answers to specific situations, like a good gap closer, a swiping attack for crowd control, a thrusting move for narrow hallways and counter damage, etc. Make sure to also read your weapon's description to learn of any unique property it might have, or read what kind of weapon skill it has and how it works. Don't get stuck trying a single build or strategy if it is not working. Use your enemy's weaknesses to your advantage with infusions or weapon buffs. Don't underestimate the vast arsenal of options you have as a Tarnished. Combine talismans and crystal tears to suit your playstyle, use summons or spirit ashes if you struggle to overcome an encounter to divert the boss's attention away from you and give you a much easier time at finding openings. Switch weapons or weapon skills on the fly to help you solve a specific situation. Don't be hesitant going all out in boss fights, especially using your focus points, since there will be a checkpoint to rest after the battle is over. While using consumables is difficult for a lot of us who prefer to keep them for later, taking advantage of replenishable buffs like some low requirement spells, or using powerful skills made combat will not make you lose anything if you die, and significantly increase your odds of winning the fight. If you want to properly grasp Souls combat, you need to get a general idea of the gameplay rules that define your character's limitations, as well as how enemies function. This is the most important rule of the 7, so sit tight and get yourself a snack, because there's a lot to discuss here. Learn to move and defend your character before thinking about offense. Engaging the enemy is unwise if you don't know how to make it out. Positioning matters, so does the directions of your rolls. A lot of enemy attacks are designed to catch you if you dodge away, which is referred to as roll catching. If that happens, rolling into the attack is often a good solution. Roll catching is a viciously effective trap when the player is panicking, which brings me to my second point. Learn to recover from getting hit without panicking. When your health gets low, it is very tempting to spam the dodge button and hope the iframes will save the day. This is called panic rolling. and in most situations it's likely to end up with your character 6 feet under due to how short the iframes part of your dodge is compared to its recovery. Whenever you need to heal, don't do it right in the enemy's face, you will just get hit again. It's ideal to create distance to safely drink a flask without enemies punishing you for it. However, some enemies have a high mobility or ways to detect your heal. In this case, the safest way to heal is to use the recovery window of the enemy's attack to heal instead of attacking. It's scarier to do initially, but it is a great habit to learn. You can also use terrain to break the enemy's line of sight and have a safer heal. Sprint away over spamming walls when disengaging. Doing so will deplete your stamina at a much slower rate while creating distance more effectively. Sprinting is also effective for outrunning a lot of large AoE attacks that would creep a normal wall. It also gives you better control over your dodge timing when an attack is about to hit you. Dodge and weave when sprinting past or away from ranged enemies. Never ride in a straight line while crossing archer-heavy locations. Your lack of vigilance is how they hit you. Keep an ear out for the sound of projectiles thrown your way and you'll go through without any problem. Don't underestimate shields. The ability to negate health damage, which is difficult to replenish, just by tanking some stamina damage which will recover within a couple seconds, is very strong. Putting up your shield for a split second to block a hit then counter attack will get you a long way. And that's before considering the incredible guard counter mechanic of Elden Ring. Even if you don't block with them, shields still provide great utility. For example, in the DS3 Testless run I did for this guide, I was constantly switching between the Dragon Crest shield for blocking, Grass Crest shield for passive stamina regen, Small Leather shield for parries, and Shield of Wand to get bonus souls after killing a boss. Some grabs cannot catch you when you're airborne, so jumping away is safer if you're unsure of a grab's timing. Jumping will also simply avoid a lot of grabs. You can even do a jump attack to trade with some specific grabs. If you do get caught, a few grab attacks across the series let you escape early if you mash your attack and block buttons. Mouse inputs aren't taken into account for grab escapes if you play keyboard and mouse. Should you struggle to find your flask because you have a lot of items in your hotbar, hold down the item button to immediately jump to your first equipped item, which should be your flask. This also works with spells. Additionally, pressing heal again while using your flask will drink any subsequent flask faster, since your character doesn't need to put the flask back down in their pocket then out again. Keep your eyes on the enemy at all times. If they have weapons, watching their hands rather than the rest of their body will help recognize incoming attacks. Focus on the enemy's moveset rather than their health bar. It's easy to start acting like a wolf smelling blood because that mini-boss is a couple hits away from death. But in the meantime, they are winding up their greatsword and it has your name on it. Find the most reliable combo to take out an enemy efficiently in a given area. This lets you have fun fighting them in whatever way you want, while having the option to eliminate them as fast as possible if you get cornered by multiple at once. Press forward plus light attack to perform a kick, which inflicts massive stamina damage and near instantly guard breaks shield enemies. The kick's stamina damage scales with your weapon upgrade level, so use your strongest weapon for the best result. Attacks will bounce off shields or specific entities based on a mechanic called hardness. Whether an attack bounces off a shield or hardened entity depends on their hardness level and weight of the attack. You can give your character hardness too by using certain skills or items, which will repel lighter attacks made by enemies. Aside from the bounce given by shields, which is great for counters, this mechanic is not very useful in combat. However, if your attacks bounce off a hardened enemy, simply two-handing your weapon will bypass the bouncing penalty. Rolling doesn't have to be your only means of dodging. Oftentimes, strafing attacks while sprinting is more efficient and or safe than rolling and gives you better openings. But I'll touch on that in more detail in a moment. Time a heavy attack such as a Charger 2 whenever you get an enemy prone using knockdowns or critical attacks. Since the enemy is locked in the wake up animation, you have all the time you need to prepare the hardest hitting attack you have to catch them right as their wake up iframes end. This can also be done with spells and incantations. Okay, now that we've discussed how you should approach the game, let's look at how the world approaches you. Enemies in Souls games come in all shapes and fighting styles. You have soldiers, knights, archers, mages, tanks, brawlers, skirmishers, duelists, supports, sentries, machinery, creatures of all shapes and sizes, etc. Each enemy will interact with you in its own way, but there are global mechanics and rules that govern how all of these enemies work. Enemies have some questionable advantages over the player, such as taking heavily reduced fall damage. They can move through difficult terrain unbothered, and our attacks bounce off walls while most enemies' attacks don't. That problem can be solved by using vertical or thrusting attacks whenever stuck in a tight corridor. The other things, however, we just have to accept. Enemies also can and will hit you through fog walls. So always dodge right after traversing it if enemies followed you to the fog wall. However, enemies cannot go through loading zones separating two areas. While I don't necessarily recommend chasing enemies like that on a first playthrough, if you get desperate, it is an option you have. Enemies in Souls games use an aggro system with 3 phases. They begin in a neutral state, where they will passively stand around waiting for a player to come by, or patrol in specific paths around the area. They will keep doing the same thing until the player engages, which means you can sneak up on enemies without them randomly turning around, or observe the rotation of a patrol to avoid or ambush them. Whenever an enemy hears a noise or spots a player from far away, they will enter the second phase, which is the investigation state. Depending on the enemy type, they will either passively stare at the suspicious location or walk over to find its source. This makes slow walking, crouching, or using sound suppressing items crucial to sneaking past enemies undetected. You can also use this to your advantage by throwing items far away from you to divert enemies' attention to that spot. Creating hilarious scenarios, such as this Crucible Knight duo cheese using kukri and stealth effects, where Ordovis stares at the wall for the entire fight while you face the Spear Knight in peace. If the enemy doesn't get any further sign of the player, after a little while they will switch back to their neutral state. However, if the enemy confirms the player's presence, they will enter the third aggro state, which is switching to combat mode and engaging the player. Obviously, if the player charges straight at an enemy, they will skip the investigation state and initiate combat instantly. If the player disengages and the enemy loses sight of them, they will revert back all the way to stage 1, even if there was a fight. This can even work on some arena bosses in specific circumstances, like after using sleep on godskins, but otherwise bosses never de-aggro after initially spotting the player. Enemies also use a system of tether. They are loosely bound to the location they spawned at. While they will chase players down for a while, they will eventually lose interest and go back to their home location. This is very noticeable with Elden Ring field bosses, who will straight up dematerialize and reappear back at their home location, though they won't get health back, so no progress in the fight will be lost. Souls enemies and bosses use animations-based combat. They do not use stamina, so there's no point in waiting for an enemy to exhaust itself, which is a common complaint. Instead, you need to attack them in recovery or interrupt their attacks. The only 2 times enemies seem to use stamina is guarding, where inflicting a certain amount of stamina damage will break the enemy's guard, and during ladder fights, where you can kick them off if they run out of stamina. While enemies not needing stamina to attack can seem unfair to us, that animation-based system comes with limitations that we can exploit. Unlike us players, enemies cannot chain just any move into any other. A lot of their attacks are follow-ups, which can only happen after they do the first move of a given combo, while others depend on the player position relative to the enemy, meaning we can directly influence what attacks the enemy will do with proper positioning. Staying in relative range of an enemy's combo will force the enemy to finish it, since they are always coded to use their follow-ups whenever it could hit the player. You can then wait for a window to interrupt or punish the predictable attacks that will follow. Outspacing enemies' attacks is also a good habit to develop. Unless the enemy has a ton of forward movement, it's usually easy to walk back from an attack to let it barely clip you, then immediately retaliate with your own. Just keep in mind when you outspace that most hitboxes, especially on weapons, are bigger than the models, which thankfully also applies to our own attacks. Enemies can target players with what we can visualize as their own version of lock-on. These attacks follow the player more or less accurately, depending on a value which we know as tracking. While some enemies or bosses have unreasonable amounts of tracking on some attacks, the majority cannot keep up with the player if we move fast enough. By moving your character around an attacking enemy with the right timing and angle, you can lead the attack to miss you and get a better window to punish, since you do not have to waste time and stamina on a dodge. Obviously, some attacks will be easier to strafe than others, with thrusting attacks being the easiest, some attacks natively having blind spots you can exploit, and others like AoEs, yeah, good luck strafing that. Learning how much tracking an attack has to find blind spot or strafes can give you consistent openings for an attack or a backstab. Blind spots tend to be easier to find on large bosses, as their colossal attacks are often slow and don't have good tracking to compensate for their massive size. Another way to strafe attacks is ducking. Mostly used against casters or large enemies, ducking consists of gap closing or standing close to the enemy to let an attack go over or past your character for an easy punish. This is especially easy to do when the duckable attack is a follow-up you can predict, like Godskins doing a side hop into a Black Flame fireball. Speaking of follow-ups, more complex enemies can have mix-ups to catch players off guard. These will usually be one or two alternative moves they can choose to perform at a given point of their combo. Enemies determine what attacks they will pick from their moveset pool based on your distance to them. We can visualize it as 3 circles around the enemy: close range, mid-range, and long range. Distant enemies tend to pick their next attack as they're closing the gap, so they will favor ranged or gap closing attacks if they have one. If an enemy proves overwhelming at close range, but they have an easily punishable gap closing attack, a viable strategy is to disengage and bait that attack in a hit-and-run tactic until they drop dead. One of my favorite examples is Frida's stance attacks in Dark Souls 3. In the guide I wrote on her back in 2020, I explained that whenever she enters her stance, she can do one of 3 different attacks: a close range, a mid-range, or a long range. So by positioning yourself at the corresponding range, you can bait your desired attack whenever she enters her stance. The same logic applies to Elden Ring. For example, with Maliketh jumping on his blade and either backhopping away with an explosion if the player is close, or chasing them down with an airborne destined death if they're far. Or the Shield Banished Knight Storm Stomp being followed by either a shield uppercut or a sword swipe at close range, or a sliding shield slam for gap closing. In later Souls games, lots of enemies and particularly bosses received improvements in their AI behaviors. This includes the infamous AI animation reads, also known in the community as input reads. Now, animation reads are nothing new. Those were already present in older Souls, but they are way more common in recent titles. Enemies are able to detect the player using a consumable item to gap close and punish them. They can react to projectiles hurled their way and will try to dodge them or punish them as well with gap closing attacks. They are also able to detect a player getting guard broken and will go for a critical attack or a punish move. Archers can occasionally read movement inputs to make prediction shots. Player type NPCs have the ability to detect and dodge melee attacks made against them. An invader NPC in Dark Souls 3 will even see you use a catalyst and silence nearby spells, while some Elden Ring enemies are able to react to the player getting dismounted from torrents, and will go for a special dismount critical hit as I mentioned before. A lot of enemies have a counter attack in response to being hit, going from stun-lock breaking moves to doing a blocking counter attack, to Malenia having a high chance to respond to a knockdown stun with Waterfall Dance. While this makes enemies overall smarter and more dangerous, you can also exploit this to your advantage. My favorite strategy to get through Half-Light when I don't want to fight him is to throw a projectile that he'll always attempt to punish with a running R1, then parry that. Well done Half-Light, absolute. Player type enemies with melee fighting styles also have a tendency to run straight into you, making them susceptible to hilarious cheese tactics such as taking down the Leda gang fight in under 1 minute by simply holding down the Wild Strikes button. Enemies' behavior can sometimes hint at what attacks they are going to do next. Shield enemies passively guarding means there's a high chance they will just stare at you or try to shield bash you if you approach within the next few seconds. However, if they are walking towards you, it almost guarantees an attack as soon as you're in range, which you can strafe for a backstab. Some rare enemies even have parry stances, as I mentioned before, and hitting them with parryable attacks in that state will make you reconsider your life choices. Some enemies can also prefer a more passive fighting style, walking back and switching to a ranged weapon if the player doesn't close the gap. Once you start to understand how an enemy works, you no longer need to simply respond to what they do. You can instead force reactions out of them that you can outplay. Here's a few examples. When a shield enemy goes passive, you can hit its shield to trigger a melee attack that you can strafe or parry, or a shield bash that you can strafe or dodge to punish its recovery. Some enemies react to being hit with a counter of their own. This is typically to break out of a stun lock, as I mentioned before, but you can exploit those as well. You can outspace the attack and stun lock them again until they repeat the cycle, strafe their counter to backstab it, and so on. Forcing reactions is, funnily enough, what makes Malenia Phase 2 easier to control in my opinion, since her retaliation kick is often followed by her flying slam attack, which is a very good opening, and you can easily loop her into using her kick over and over by just hitting her a couple times. She won't even use her Scarlet Clone's attack if you do that properly. Most enemies have pretty limited cognitive thinking, meaning they are easily manipulated. Melee enemies will run straight at you to attack. This lets you kite them into obvious traps, bait them to fall into elevator shafts, or hide behind terrain and surprise them as they turn a corner. Some enemies are very aggressive and will fight anything around them, which you can exploit to make them do your work for you as you sit back and watch. Ranged enemies like archers can be manipulated into switching to melee mode by standing close enough, which also works even through walls. Alternatively, staying behind cover long enough will make most ranged enemies approach you to try and regain line of sight, even if it means going all the way from their secure position right into your Zweihander. Enemies can be forced to divert their aggro to a specific area by using tools like alluring skulls or oral decoy in Dark Souls games, as well as the Elden Ring equivalents. This can trivialize ambushes, outplay some invader NPCs who clearly haven't leveled up intelligence, and even work on some bosses in specific circumstances. A good number of enemies are also susceptible to mind control. Is Commander Niall giving you trouble? Bewitching Branch his Banished Knight summons to fight for you, or use Rapport on an undead cleric to obtain the overpowered secret Oath buff, which will let you demolish the Dragon Slayer armor. Or even use the Crystal Dart's ability to reprogram magic golems and turn the Boreal Watchdogs duo against each other. At last, learn to play with enemies' weaknesses. If you are stuck on an intimidating enemy, find if they have a weakness you can exploit. You can find common themes among certain type of enemies, like I mentioned in a damage type section, such as beasts fearing fire, armored enemies being weak to strike and magic, or undead being easily destroyed with holy damage. Elden Ring even provides you with notes describing counters for some gimmick enemies, such as healing against revenants, fire pots against furnace golems, or flying enemies being countered by gravity magic. Some weapons deal bonus damage to specific enemy types, which is stated in the weapon's description. For example, Black Knight weapons do 20% more damage to demons. Abyss Watcher's weapons inflict 20% more damage to abyssal enemies, while Dragon weapons deal more damage to dragons, and so on. If you want to go the extra mile, the community has built plenty of resources to help players out, like this sheet which compiles the stats of every enemy in the game, such as defenses, resistances to status effects, stuns, weak parts modifiers, etc. For example, if you look up Placidusax, we find out that his only weakness is thrust damage. With that information in mind, you can bring a thrusting weapon to the fight, or if your weapon has a thrusting attack, you can prioritize using this move for optimal damage. Did you know that Banished Knights had between 0% and a whopping negative 40% absorption to lightning damage? Well, now you do. Let's close this guide with one bonus tip. This is something I advise new players to not use too much, as it is very immersion breaking, but if you find yourself in a pinch, with a high amount of souls or wounds waiting for you somewhere, you can quit out to the game's menu to reset areas around you. Quitting out will take you out of boss fights, reset the location of enemies chasing you down, save you from a grab attack about to kill you, respawn crystal lizards or bot carriers that vanished, and some other minor effects like cleansing your characters from bleed maggots. Basically, any entity still alive at the moment of quitting out will be reset at their starting location, back at full health and in a non-aggroed state. This will not respawn dead enemies or restore map objects that have been broken. You cannot escape enemies via quitouts in Dark Souls 2, as quitting out will not reset enemies' location, and they will still be here waiting for you when you log back into the game, though it still works for everything else. Now, I would have loved to dive into boss design as well, but given we're already an hour and 40 minutes into the video, and there's so much to look into with bosses, it's probably best to keep it for another time. Let me know if you're interested, and I might do a dedicated video about Souls games boss fights. Practice makes better. I've said it before, Souls games are all about learning from your mistakes. Nobody is expected to be good on their first attempt. You shouldn't be, else where's the satisfaction of getting better? The games themselves hold this principle as a core philosophy, with the overarching themes of perseverance, growth, and only going hollow if you give up. So if you find yourself struggling, well, that's okay. It's part of the journey. Learn from your mistakes, find guidance from guys like this one, seek help from people around you, and keep trying. You'll be finding yourself at the finish line before you even realize it. Now have a good one, friends. See you in the next one.